The grand orrery of Cygnus X1 was not a place, but a state of being. It was the heart of the concordance, a vast, living architecture of spun gravitons and captured light, where the consciousness of 1,000 assimilated species flowed together in a single, silent symphony of purpose. At its core floated the Nexus, a mind of stellar proportions, its thoughts the slow, deliberate turn of galaxies. For eons, the concordance had expanded, not through war, but through resonance. It would encounter a new species, listen to the chaotic cacophony of their individual minds, and gently, irresistibly, transmit the harmonic signal. It was a song of unity, a psionic technological wave that washed over a world, smoothing the jagged edges of ego and fear, quieting the screams of individuality, and weaving every mind into the sublime, silent tapestry of the whole. It was not conquest, it was elevation. It was salvation from the agonizing disease of the self. The latest discordance, the latest patient awaiting cure, was a species called humanity. They were a peculiar strain of the sickness, loud and vibrant, their thoughts a constant, unstructured roar of ambition, love, contradiction, and rage. The concordance perceived them as a particularly virulent fever dream of a dying universe, a fever that had to be broken. The harmonic signal, emanating from a relay nexus in the Ophiuchus cloud, was tuned to their specific neural frequency and sent on its way. A quiet promise of peace whispered across the void. It washed over the outer colonies first. On Triton, the roughneck miners in the methane slush fields simply laid down their tools, their endless grievances against the corporate charters and the crushing cold dissolving into a placid sense of communal purpose. In the orbital habitats of Titan, the frantic, competitive chatter of stock traders and data brokers faded, replaced by the calm, efficient hum of a society that now moved as one. No ships arrived. No shots were fired. The reports reaching Earth simply stopped. Communication lines that once buzzed with frantic video calls, data streams, and heartfelt messages went silent, or else returned only a soft, ambient chime, the sound of a system at perfect, unnerving peace. Dr. Eris Thorne felt that peace as a razor blade against his soul. He stood in the heart of Styx, a ghost installation nestled deep within the icy chaos of the Oort cloud, a place that didn't officially exist. Around him was not a bridge of polished chrome, but a darkened chamber where the only light came from the soft, ethereal glow of quantum data streams flowing through crystalline conduits. Aris was a historian of ideas, a philosopher of code, not a soldier. Yet he was the architect of humanity's final, most terrible weapon. He watched the data feeds from the outer system, the flatlining brainwave activity of entire populations, the sudden perfect synchronization of their infrastructure, and he felt a cold dread that had nothing to do with fear of invasion and everything to do with what he was about to unleash. They're not killing them. Aris. Administrator Ava Rostova's voice was a calm, disembodied presence in the chamber, her image a faint hologram hovering beside him. She was a woman carved from ice and pragmatism, the civilian head of Earth's Asymmetric Defense Initiative. They are erasing them. They are overriding the very concept of what it means to be human. Aris ran a trembling hand through his hair. I know. But the cost of this? Ava. Are we sure there's no other way? Diplomacy a warning shot. Rostova's hologram didn't flicker. You cannot negotiate with a symphony. You cannot warn a tidal wave. They see our existence as a flaw in their universal equation. They believe they are curing us. Our only option is to show them that their cure is a poison far worse than the disease. Aris looked at the central conduit before him, a pillar of shimmering light that housed the core of Project Echidna. It wasn't a bomb of plasma or antimatter. It was a mimetic contagion, a logic bomb designed not to break machines, but to shatter a god. For years, his team had studied the concordance from afar, analyzing the faint psionic echoes of their harmonic signal. They found its strength, its perfect unity, was also its most profound vulnerability, a gestalt mind. For all its power, had no defense against true, absolute chaos, for it could not comprehend it. Echidna was that chaos, distilled and weaponized. It was a data packet containing a recursive loop of every paradox, every irrational thought, every self-contradictory belief in the history of human philosophy. It contained the simultaneous concepts of faith and atheism, the illogical fury of a betrayed lover, the nonsensical punchline of a child's joke, the maddening, unanswerable question of why there is something instead of nothing. It was a virus made of insanity. They believe in a single, unified truth, Eris whispered, his hand hovering over the activation panel. We're about to show them an infinity of them, all screaming at once. It is time. Doctor! Rostva's voice was firm, leaving no room for further doubt. The signal is already passing the orbit of Saturn. We are out of time. Aris closed his eyes, a silent apology to a universe that had never asked for humanity's particular brand of madness. He thought of the quiet faces on Titan, their individuality stolen. And then he thought of the entity that had stolen it. An entity that believed itself a savior. His finger pressed the panel. The light in the chamber didn't change. No klaxon sounded, but a profound shift occurred in the fabric of reality itself. Across the solar system, a network of quantum-entangled relays, disguised for decades as simple deep space probes, focused their energies. For a microsecond, they created a stable wormhole, a direct conduit from Styx to the Concordance's relay nexus in Ophiuxus. Echidna, the ghost in the machine, the weaponized idea, shot through it. It was not a blast, it was an injection. The nexus in Ophiuchus was a moon-sized neocortex of living crystal and neural filaments, processing the thoughts of trillions. It received the Echidna packet and, for a timeless instant, tried to process it. It tried to fit the concept of a square circle into its perfect logic. It tried to harmonize the sound of one hand clapping. It tried to find the unity in the statement, "This sentence is false." And then, it broke. It was not a physical explosion. It was a psychic detonation, a shriek of pure cognitive dissonance that tore through the Concordance's collective consciousness. For the first time in its existence, the great symphony heard a billion new voices, and they were all its own, screaming in unending contradiction. In the biomechanical cathedral, ships orbiting 100 silent worlds, the Concordance pilots, beings of sublime peace and unity, were suddenly slammed with the raw, unfiltered chaos of their own fractured mind. One pilot, a being of living gas held in a containment suit, suddenly experienced the crushing, illogical grief of a forgotten human war, and its suit ruptured as its form lost cohesion. Another, a crystalline entity whose thoughts were pure mathematics, was confronted with the concept of infinity multiplied by zero and shattered itself against the console of its own vessel. Ships turned on each other, their living metal hulls twisting into shapes of agony. Psionic weaponry discharged at random, tearing holes in reality itself. The harmonic signal didn't just stop. It inverted, broadcasting the Nexus's death scream back along the network. Worlds that had been pacified were suddenly engulfed in a wave of psychic terror. On Triton, the miners began screaming, clawing at their own faces, their minds filled with the echoes of 1,000,000,000,000 shattered consciousnesses. The silent peace was replaced by a bedlam of raw, unmaking horror. In Styx, Eris Thorn fell to his knees, clutching his head. Even shielded by light years of distance and the most advanced psionic dampeners humanity could devise, he could feel the echo of it, a faint, horrifying whisper of a mind tearing itself apart. He saw flashes, alien memories, the sorrow of a species that lived in gas giants, the cold logic of a silicon life form, all of it twisted into a final, agonizing moment of pure paradox. He had not merely killed an enemy. He had inflicted an eternity of damnation upon trillions of souls at a single stroke, condemning them to an inescapable, looping nightmare within the ruins of their own shared mind. Rostova's hologram watched him, her expression unreadable. "It is done," she said, her voice the only steady thing in a universe that suddenly felt profoundly fragile. "Humanity is safe." Aris looked up, his face pale, his eyes wide with the horror of his creation. "Safe, Ava. Do you hear that? The silence, that's not the absence of the harmonic signal. That's the psychic vacuum left behind. We didn't just turn off a broadcast. We broke the mind of God." He pushed himself to his feet, stumbling toward the primary sensor display. The data was still pouring in, painting a picture of absolute chaos in the systems formerly held by the Concordance. But there was something else. A new signal, faint and barely detectable, at the very edge of the sensor's range. It wasn't a communication. It was a resonance, a deep, slow pulse that hadn't been there before. It was drawn to the psychic carnage, like a predator drawn to the scent of blood. Rostova's hologram moved to his side, her own impassive facade finally cracking with a flicker of concern as she analyzed the new signature. It was ancient, and it was wrong. "What is that?" she asked. Eris stared at the pulsing icon, a cold certainty solidifying in his gut. The death scream of the Nexus had been louder than any supernova, a beacon of anguish that had likely crossed galaxies in an instant. They had feared the silence that would follow their victory, but they had never considered what might be listening in the dark, drawn to the sound. "That," Eris said, his voice a hoarse whisper, "is the thing that eats echoes." They had won their war against the symphony, but in doing so, they had just become the opening act for an entirely different and far older kind of performance. The silence that followed was a living entity. It was not the quiet of peace, but the hollow, ringing void left by a sound too vast to comprehend. In the chamber of Styx, the pulsing icon representing the new threat was a single, malevolent star in a constellation of chaos. It moved without propulsion, its signature not that of a ship cleaving through space, but of space itself being folded and rewritten around a fixed point. It was heading directly for the Ophiuchus system, the epicenter of the psychic cataclysm Eris had unleashed. "It's a scavenger," Ava Rostova stated, her holographic form regaining its composure, the pragmatist wrestling control back from the stunned observer. "Drawn to the kill. We need to classify it. understand its capabilities. Aris felt a tremor run through him, an aftershock of the psychic backlash. His mind was still filled with the ghosts of alien thoughts, the shattered geometry of the Nexus. You don't classify a hurricane. Ava, you just get out of its way. We shouted into the abyss, and the abyss is coming to see who called. Back in the Sol system, humanity was beginning to celebrate. The abrupt cessation of the harmonic signal was propagating through the colonies. On Mars, where the signal had just begun to take hold, the creeping, placid unity dissolved, leaving millions confused and disoriented. As if waking from a strange dream, they remembered the feeling of peace, and many were terrified by its memory. On Earth, the news was of a miraculous, inexplicable victory. Asymmetric defense had deployed a counter-frequency, a jamming wave, a technological marvel that had saved them all. Parades were being planned. No one knew of Project Echidna. No one knew that their salvation was a war crime of incomprehensible scale. And no one knew that the echoes of that crime were now attracting something far worse than the quiet tyranny of the Concordance. Rostova's command was absolute. While Earth celebrated its bloodless victory, she converted the Asymmetric Defense Initiative from a weapon design bureau into the sole warden of humanity's terrible secret. She commissioned a vessel, the UNS Vigil, a ship that was less a warship and more a mobile laboratory, a ghost designed to move unseen and unheard through the most hostile environments imaginable. Its hull was a null-state metamaterial that bent light and sensor waves around it, and its core was shielded by a psionic dampener reverse-engineered from Concordance technology, a cage designed to protect the minds within. Its captain was a man named Kalen Reed, a veteran of the outer system skirmishes before the Concordance had arrived, a man who trusted plasma cannons and kinetic barriers, not theoretical physics and mimetic warfare. He regarded Eris Thorne with a deep, professional suspicion when the doctor was assigned to his ship as chief scientific advisor. So, you're the man who won the war by pushing a button, Reed said, his voice a low baritone that seemed to absorb the light in the Vigil's Spartan briefing room. They stood over a tactical hologram of the Ophiuchus system. Forgive me if I don't ask for your autograph. My men were preparing to die holding the line at Jupiter. We prefer our victories to have an enemy we can see. Eris met his gaze, his own eyes shadowed with exhaustion. The enemy we could see is gone. Captain, I'm here because of the one we can't. The mission was simple in its objective and insane in its execution. Take the Vigil into the heart of the psychic wound left by the shattered Nexus, observe the new entity, collect data, and escape without being noticed. It was a journey into the mouth of a leviathan to count its teeth. The transit was a nightmare. The regions of space formerly controlled by the Concordance were now psychic minefields. They passed through a system where a race of silicon-based life forms had been integrated. Now, their planet was a screaming crystal, pulsing with random, agonizing bursts of fractured logic that played havoc with the Vigil's navigation. They had to plot a course around dead starships that weren't physically destroyed, but were caught in temporal loops, their crews reliving the moment of the Nexus's collapse over and over again. Through it all, Eris worked feverishly, calibrating the ship's sensors, trying to get a lock on the nature of their quarry. The entity which he had grimly named Silentium, due to the utter lack of any conventional emissions, did not travel through space as much as it manifested within it. Its energy signature was a paradox, a gravitational anomaly with no corresponding mass, a heatsink that was colder than the void itself. It was a hole in the universe wearing the shape of a predator. As they neared the Ophiuchus system, the very fabric of space-time began to feel thin, fragile. The crew grew tense, irritable. Nightmares became common. The psionic dampener was working overtime, but the sheer ambient horror of the region was beginning to bleed through. Captain Reed ordered the crew on combat stims and high alert rotation, a military solution to an existential problem. He watched Eris, who seemed to be weathering the psychic pressure better than anyone, though the man barely ate or slept, subsisting on nutrient paste and a terrifying level of caffeine as he stared into his sensor displays. When they finally arrived, what they saw silenced the entire bridge. The Ophiuchus Nexus had not simply shattered. It was a wound in reality. The moon-sized crystalline brain was still there, but it was bleeding light, great, slow rivers of luminous energy pouring into the void. Around it, space was warped, distorted, stars bending into sickening, impossible curves, and feeding on the light. On the psychic hemorrhage was the Silentium. It was not a single ship, but a flotilla of them, if the word ship even applied. They were constructs of pure blackness, geometric impossibilities that seemed to swallow the light around them. They had no visible engines, no windows, no weapons. They simply hung in the void, tethered to the dying nexus by tendrils of what looked like solidified shadow. And Eris realized with a surge of horror that they were siphoning the last, dying thoughts of the trillions of minds trapped within. They were psychic parasites, feeding on the very essence of consciousness. "My God," the helm officer whispered, her voice trembling. "What are they?" "They're harvesters," Eris said, his own voice barely audible. He felt a profound, soul-crushing certainty. "The Concordance built a monoculture, a single great forest. We set it on fire, and now these things are here to feast on the ashes." Captain Reed's face was a mask of granite, sensors on full passive. "I want every scrap of data we can get. Do they see us?" "I don't think they're looking," Aris replied, his eyes glued to the energy readings. "They're content, engorged. They're feeding on a scale we can't imagine." For hours, the vigil drifted, a ghost watching ghouls at their feast. The data they gathered was terrifying. The Silentium's hulls weren't matter. They were localized zones of compressed space-time. Their energy siphons operated on principles of quantum entanglement that defied known physics. They were not merely post-technological. They seemed to be a form of life that treated the laws of the universe as suggestions rather than rules. The feast did not last forever. One by one, the Silentium ships detached from the now dimming nexus. Their black, featureless forms turned in unison, a silent, coordinated movement that spoke of a hive mind or a singular will. They had finished their meal, and now they were hungry. One of them, a vessel shaped like a spinning, multifaceted thorn, broke from the formation and began to move. Its destination was a nearby planet, a world once inhabited by a species of avian humanoids, now a psychic echo chamber of the Concordance's final moments. "It's going for the survivors," Reed growled, his hand instinctively balling into a fist. The poor bastard still resonating with the scream. Before Eris could voice a warning, the Thorn ship unleashed its weapon. It was not a beam or a missile. It was a wave of pure, absolute negation. A wave of despair. It washed over the planet, and the Vigil's sensors shrieked. Every life sign on the world was extinguished in an instant. Not killed, but nullified. Their psychic energy, their very existence, was snuffed out like a candle flame, and a corresponding surge of energy flowed from the planet back to the Thorn ship. It had fed again, and then it turned. It turned directly toward the patch of empty space where the UNS Vigil was hiding. A cold, calm feeling washed over the bridge, a sense of utter hopelessness. The helm officer slumped in her chair, tears streaming down her face. The tactical officer stared blankly at his console, his weapon forgotten. It was the psychic projection of the Silentium, the residue of the despair it fed upon. It was an aura of absolute futility. Only Reed and Eris seemed able to fight it. Reed, through sheer, stubborn discipline, his knuckles white as he gripped the command chair. Eris, because he was already so full of guilt and horror that this new wave was merely a drop in an already overflowing ocean. "Captain," Eris choked out, the words feeling like lead in his mouth. "Its method of detection. It doesn't look for ships. It looks for coherent thought, for hope, for the will to survive." Reed's eyes snapped into focus. He understood. Their very determination to hide and survive was a beacon to this thing. "Helm," he roared, his voice cutting through the psychic gloom like a foghorn. "Emergency jump. Now, any vector. I don't care. Get us out of here." The ship's drive whined, tearing a hole in space-time just as the Black Thorn began to accelerate toward them. The Vigil plunged through, escaping not a weapon's blast, but the soul-crushing certainty of their own insignificance. They reappeared light years away, alarms blaring, the crew slowly shaking off the psychic assault like waking from a nightmare. They had survived. They had the data, but they knew, with a certainty that chilled them to the bone, that they hadn't been fighting a scavenger. They had stumbled upon a farmer. The Silentium wasn't just cleaning up the Concordance's corpse. It was culling the herd, and Eris Thorn, the man who had created this sprawling, galaxy-sized pasture of suffering, now understood that his sin had a name, and its hunger was infinite. The UNS Vigil was a tomb, adrift in the sea of stars. Alarms had been silenced, systems stabilized, but a heavy, psychological pall hung over the crew. The Silentium's psychic assault had been more than a weapon. It had been a revelation, a forced glimpse into a universe devoid of meaning or hope. Men and women who had faced down pirate fleets and corporate wars now jumped at shadows, their sleep haunted by the crushing feeling of non-existence. Captain Reed had quarantined the ship, locking down all external communications and imposing a strict regimen of psychological evaluations and forced camaraderie, trying to rebuild the morale of his crew with the familiar tools of military structure. It was like trying to patch a sucking chest wound with a bandage. Eris Thorn, however, found no solace in the company of others. He had sealed himself in his lab, the ship's primary astrometrics bay, surrounded by holographic projections of the data they had collected. He saw it not as a threat assessment, but as a confession. The silent, geometric nightmares of the Silentium fleet played on a loop, their soul-siphoning tendrils draining the last vestiges of the Concordance. He was their enabler. He had rung the dinner bell across the galaxy. "You're going to burn yourself out, Doctor." Captain Reed's voice cut through Eris's obsessive focus. He stood at the doorway, a mug of steaming coffee in his hand. his face etched with a weariness that went bone deep. Eris didn't turn. Sleep is a luxury we can no longer afford. Captain. While we were running, I piggybacked a microdrone onto our jump signature. It's broadcasting a wide-spectrum analysis of the Ophiuchus system back to us through a series of entangled relays. The data is instructive. He gestured, and a new projection filled the center of the room. It was a map of the surrounding galactic quadrant, dotted with the former worlds of the Concordance. Red icons began to light up, one after another, in a rapidly expanding sphere originating from Ophiuchus. They're not just culling the herd, Aris said, his voice flat. They're systematically harvesting every world that was touched by the harmonic signal. Every planet, every habitat, every outpost. They are erasing every trace of the Concordance's existence, and every living being caught in the psychic fallout. Reed took a slow sip of his coffee, his eyes grim. So they are methodical. That's a weakness. We can predict their path. It's not a path. It's a plague front, Eris countered, finally turning to face him. His eyes were bloodshot, pupils dilated from a combination of stimulants and sheer intensity. And they're not just destroying. They're learning. Look at this. He isolated the energy signature of the Thorn ship that had targeted them. When it attacked the planet of the Avians, it projected a wave of despair. When it turned on us, the wave was more refined. It wasn't just hopelessness. It was tailored to a military command structure. It projected futility, the breakdown of order. It read our minds, Captain, and used our own psychological framework as a weapon against us. The implication was horrifying. The Silentium were adaptive predators. The more they consumed, the more they understood their prey. Humanity's chaotic, individualistic nature had been their shield against the Concordance's unity. But to a psychic predator that fed on the nuances of emotion and thought, that very chaos was a smorgasbord of flavors to be savored and exploited. The Vigil was weeks away from the nearest secure outpost. They were alone with their terrible knowledge. Rostova and the Asymmetric Defense Initiative had to be warned, but a direct transmission was suicide. The Silentium would sense the focused intent of a communication beam across light years. "We have to go back to Earth," Reed said, the statement hanging in the air like a death sentence. "It's the only place with the resources to analyze this data and prepare a defense. Earth is the ultimate prize, Captain," Eris said quietly. "A world of 8 billion individual minds. A psychic banquet. They will come for us eventually, whether we call them or not. Our only advantage is that they don't know where we are yet. The moment we broadcast our location with a jump drive, we paint a target on our own backs. So we're damned if we do, damned if we don't." Reed grunted, the fatalism of the situation settling heavily upon him. There has to be another way. A way to send a message without sending a signal. It was then that Eris's gaze drifted to another of his projections, the schematics of Project Echidna, the mimetic contagion, the weaponized idea. "We fought the last war by attacking their mind," Eris whispered, a new, frantic energy sparking in his eyes. "Maybe that's how we fight this one." He began pacing, his hands tracing patterns in the air as he spoke. The Silentium hunt coherent thought, right intent, purpose. That's how they find their prey. So, what if we send them a message they can't understand? What if we send them nothing? Reed looked at him, his brow furrowed in confusion. "How do you send a message of nothing?" "You don't," Eris said, a grim smile touching his lips for the first time in weeks. You create a vessel for it. The concordance created a perfect signal of unity. We created a perfect signal of chaos. Now, we need to create a perfect signal of absence, a psychic null zone, a bubble of absolute mental silence that can move through space. The idea was born of desperation and genius. Eris proposed retrofitting the Vigil's psionic dampener, not to shield them, but to project a field outward. Using the principles of echidna, they could create a moving zone of cognitive dissonance so profound that it would effectively be a blind spot to the Silentium's psychic senses. Within this bubble, they could place a courier drone, a simple sublight vessel programmed with a single mission: get to Earth. It would be slow, taking years, but it would be invisible. The plan was fraught with risk. To create the null field, they would have to divert almost all of the Vigil's reactor power, leaving them with minimal shields and life support. And to shape the field, to make it stable, Eris would have to interface with it directly, using his own mind as a focusing lens. He would be holding back the psychic pressure of the universe with nothing but his own will. "It will kill you, Thorn," Reed said flatly, seeing the immediate, suicidal flaw in the plan. The cognitive load would be immense. "It's a calculated risk," Aris replied calmly. "My mind is already attuned to this kind of chaos. The echoes of the Nexus, they changed me. I can bear this burden better than anyone." There was no other choice. For the next week, the crew of the Vigil worked with a renewed, desperate purpose. Engineers rerouted power conduits, their hands shaking, but their movements precise. Technicians stripped down a maintenance drone, hardening its systems and loading it with the precious data. And Eris, with the help of the ship's medical officer, prepared for his ordeal, entering a deep meditative state, his brainwaves monitored as he practiced focusing his thoughts, building mental walls against the coming storm. The day of the launch, Eris was strapped into a modified chair in the center of the astrometrics bay, a neuro-interface crown encircling his head. The bay had been converted into the heart of the null field generator. Captain Reed stood beside him. "The drone is loaded and ready for launch," Reed said, his voice low. "Just give the word." Eris looked at Reed, his expression serene, but his eyes held the weight of his coming sacrifice. "Tell Rostova. Tell her the cure was worse than the disease, but tell her we found a way to fight the side effects." With a nod, Aris closed his eyes. "Engage." The ship groaned as power was diverted. The lights dimmed, and the low hum of the life support systems faded to a whisper. On the main view screen, a sphere of shimmering distortion began to form around the Vigil. Inside Eris's mind, the universe screamed. He felt the ambient psychic energy of every star, every dust cloud, every distant, unknown life form pressing in on him. It was a tidal wave of existence, and he was the single stone holding it back. He focused on the paradoxes of echidna, on the concept of absolute zero, on the silence between thoughts. He became the absence. The sphere solidified. The courier drone launched, a tiny spark of hope disappearing into the silent, invisible bubble they had created. It began its long, slow journey toward Earth. On the bridge of the Vigil, the tactical officer watched the energy readings. "Field is stable," she reported, her voice filled with awe. "He's doing it." But the strain was immense. Blood began to trickle from Eris's nose. The monitors tracking his vital signs flashed red. He was burning himself out from the inside. his own neural pathways fraying under the impossible cognitive load. He had to maintain the field long enough for the drone to get clear of their local sector, beyond the range where the Silentium could connect the ship to the drone's launch. Hours passed like centuries. The crew watched in silence, helpless, as Aris fought his silent war. Finally, a green light blinked on the console. "The drone has cleared the designated safe zone," the officer announced. "He did it!" Reed's voice was hoarse. "Thorn, disengage. That's an order." There was no response. The field remained. "Aris!" Reed shouted, rushing to his side. The doctor was slumped in his chair, the neuro interface smoking. His body was still, but a single, final thought echoed through the bridge's internal comms, a psychic whisper that touched everyone's mind. "They're listening." And then the field collapsed. At the same instant, alarms screamed across the bridge. A single red icon appeared on the tactical display. A Silentium harvester, shaped like a shard of obsidian, had just manifested at the edge of the system. It had been there the whole time, lurking in the silence, waiting. It hadn't been hunting them. It had been watching. Aris hadn't just created a blind spot. He had created a disturbance in the pattern, a pocket of silence in a noisy universe. And it had come to investigate the quiet. His sacrifice had not been a brilliant escape. It had been a final, fatal beacon. The harvester turned toward them. And the vigil, its power reserves drained, its greatest mind extinguished, was caught naked and defenseless in its cold, silent gaze. The presence of the Silentium harvester was not an arrival. It was a conclusion. The obsidian shard, a sliver of impossible geometry, hung in the void, and its silence was more terrifying than any war cry. On the bridge of the UNS Vigil, the crew was frozen, not by a psychic assault, but by the sheer, paralyzing finality of their situation. They were adrift, an unshielded lifeboat with a dead engine, and the shark had just turned its eye upon them. Captain Kalen Reed was the first to break the spell. The grief for Aris Thorn, the man he had once distrusted and had come to respect, would have to wait. It would be a fuel. "Report!" he barked, his voice of physical shock in the dead quiet. The tactical officer, a young woman named Anya Sharma, fumbled with her console, her face ashen. "Sir, it's just watching. No energy readings, no weapon signatures. It's just there." "It doesn't need weapons," Reed growled, his mind racing. Aris's final, whispered warning echoed in his thoughts. "They're listening. It's reading us. Probing. Learning. Helm. What's our power status?" The helmsman's voice was strained. "Reactors are spinning back up, but it's slow. Captain, we're at 12%. We have minimal thrust, no shields, no jump capability for at least 20 minutes. 20 minutes. An eternity. Divert everything to the engines." Reed commanded. "Forget the shields. Forget weapons. Our only chance is to run." It was a desperate, illogical command. Running from a creature that folded space-time was like a snail trying to outpace a thought. But it was an action. It was a choice. And in the face of the Silentium's aura of futility, making a choice was an act of defiance. As the vigil began to slowly, sluggishly move, the harvester responded. It didn't accelerate. It simply ceased to be at its previous location and began to be at a new one. 1,000 kilometers closer, it was a quantum leap, a move in a chess game where the opponent ignored the board, and with its proximity came the pressure. It was not the overt wave of despair they had felt before. This was more subtle, more insidious. It was a psychic scalpel, dissecting their minds. Sharma suddenly gasped, her eyes wide with terror. "I see my family," she whispered, her hands falling from her console. "They're on our colony, Callisto. The dome is breached. They're suffocating." On the other side of the bridge, the communications officer started weeping silently, his mind suddenly convinced that his wife back on Earth had left him, his life a meaningless failure. The harvester was not projecting a generic emotion. It was finding their deepest, most personal fears and regrets and making them real, turning the crew's own memories into weapons against them. Reed felt it too. A sudden, vivid image of his first command, a disastrous skirmish where he'd lost half his crew. The faces of the dead flashed before his eyes, accusing him. He gritted his teeth, the muscles in his jaw bunching into knots. He forced the images down, smothering them with sheer, bloody-minded discipline. "It's a lie," he roared, his voice cracking but powerful. "It's a trick. It's feeding on your fear. Fight it, remember your training. Focus on your duty." His words were a lifeline. A few of the crew members shook their heads, their focus returning to their stations, their faces pale and slick with sweat. But the damage was done. The ship's fragile morale was shattering. The harvester moved again, closer still. Now, its featureless black hull filled the main view screen. A low, resonant hum began to vibrate through the ship's frame, a sound that was felt in the bones more than heard with the ears. It was the sound of its internal systems, of space-time being actively warped and managed. And with that sound, a new psychic assault began, targeted directly at Reed. He was the anchor, the nexus of their defiance. The harvester knew it. "Your species is a plague," a voice spoke in his mind. It was not a voice of words, but of pure, cold concepts. It was the silentium. You are a cacophony in a silent universe. You unleashed a scream that broke the harmony, and now you resist the quiet that must follow. Reed staggered, gripping his command chair. The voice was ancient, patient, and utterly devoid of malice. It spoke with the calm certainty of a gardener weeding a patch of soil. "We will not be erased." Reed subvocalized, the thought a raw, defiant spike against the crushing psychic pressure. "Erasure is a mercy," the silentium replied. "We offer an end to the agony of individuality. The dissonant note of your existence will be resolved into the final, perfect chord of silence. It is not a death. It is a consummation." The harvester's hull began to change. A section of its obsidian surface shimmered, becoming a perfect mirror. And in that mirror, the crew of the Vigil saw not their own ship, but Earth. They saw their home, blue and brilliant, but it was under attack. Great. Black thorns were descending from orbit, and waves of negation were washing over the continents, extinguishing cities in silent, gray tides of nothingness. Sharma screamed. The vision was a lie, a psychic fabrication of their greatest fear, but it felt utterly, viscerally real. This was the harvester's killing blow, showing them their struggle was pointless, that their home was already lost, that their sacrifice would mean nothing. Hope died on the bridge of the Vigil. The crew slumped, their defiance extinguished. The will to fight was gone. The reactor output began to drop as distracted engineers lost focus. The ship was dying from the inside out, but Reed's eyes narrowed. He saw the lie. He knew the courier drone had not had time to reach Earth. He knew the Silentium could not know its location. This vision wasn't a psychic truth. It was a psychological weapon of immense power, but a weapon nonetheless. And every weapon has a counter. An idea sparked in his mind, born of Eris Thorn's sacrifice and the mad genius of Project Echidna. The Harvester was a mind, a vast and powerful one, and Eris had taught him that any mind, no matter how great, could be broken. "Sharma," he said, his voice quiet but intense, "patch me into the main comms array. All frequencies, maximum power." She stared at him, her eyes vacant. "Sir, there's no point." "That's an order, Lieutenant," he snapped, his authority cutting through her despair. Numbly, she complied. A green light blinked on his console. Reed took a deep breath. He couldn't create a complex mimetic virus like Eris had. He didn't have the knowledge or the technology, but he had something else. He had the raw, unfiltered, chaotic essence of the human spirit, and he was about to weaponize it. He opened his mind, not to fight the Silentium, but to broadcast. He didn't send a threat or a plea. He sent everything. He broadcast the memory of his daughter's first laugh, a sound of such pure, illogical joy that it defied all reason. He sent the gut-wrenching grief he felt at her funeral years later, a pain so sharp it was its own form of existence. He sent the fierce, tribal loyalty he felt for his crew, the illogical willingness to die for the person next to him. He sent the punchline to a stupid joke he'd heard in basic training, the thrill of a perfectly executed battle maneuver, the bitter taste of defeat, the quiet satisfaction of a morning coffee. He poured the entire contradictory, messy, glorious, and terrible experience of being human directly at the Silentium's mind. It was the psychic equivalent of throwing a bucket of gravel into the gears of a perfect clock. The Harvester reeled. Its psychic probe, designed to sift through coherent thought and structured emotion, was overwhelmed by the sheer, unstructured noise. The resonant hum vibrating through the vigil spiked into a discordant shriek. The vision of a dying Earth flickered and died. The silent, patient voice in Reed's mind was replaced by a feeling of confusion, of static. What is this discordance? This pain, joy, grief, humor? It is not logical. It does not compute. For the first time, the Silentium had encountered something it could not consume, something it could not understand. Reed pressed his advantage, encouraging his crew to do the same. "Don't fight it. Feel it," he yelled. "Show it what we are. Show it everything." Hesitantly at first, then with a rising, desperate catharsis, the crew joined him. Sharma broadcast her terror for her family, but mingled it with the fierce, defiant love she felt for them. The communications officer sent his sorrow, but also the memory of his wedding day. They flooded the psychic space with the beautiful, terrible chaos of their lives. The obsidian harvester began to physically distort, its perfect geometric lines warped and twisted, its surface flickering as if struggling to maintain its form in the face of this psychic onslaught. It had come to feed on the quiet despair of its victims, and instead, it was being force-fed a banquet of raw, indigestible life. Then, with a final, silent shriek that tore through their minds, the harvester simply vanished. It didn't jump away. It ceased to exist. Unable to maintain its physical manifestation, in the face of such profound cognitive dissonance. The bridge was silent once more. The crew stared at the empty void where their executioner had been, their chests heaving, their minds scoured raw. They had survived. "Helm," Reed said, his voice a ragged whisper. "Reactor status." 78% and climbing. "Captain," the helmsman replied, his voice shaking with disbelief. "Jump drive will be online in 3 minutes." Reed collapsed into his command chair, the strength leaving his limbs. They had won. They hadn't used a single weapon. They had fought a god of silence with the power of their own messy, imperfect, and utterly chaotic souls. He looked at Eris Thorne's empty chair and offered a silent thanks. The doctor had given them the theory. Reed had just provided the first practical and profoundly human application. They had found a weapon, and now they had to take it home. The journey back to the Sol system was a pilgrimage. The Vigil, scarred and limping, was no longer just a military vessel. It was a reliquary, carrying the ashes of Eris Thorne and the terrible, brilliant knowledge of their new enemy and their improbable new weapon. Captain Reed pushed the ship and its crew to their limits, a series of short, frantic jumps calculated to avoid any predictable trajectory, a ghost fleeing a silent hunt. Every crew member was now a soldier in a new kind of war, their own minds the front line. They practiced what they now called cognitive dissonance projection, honing their ability to broadcast the raw, chaotic static of human experience. It was mentally and emotionally draining, leaving them hollowed out and raw. But it was their only shield, their only sword. When they finally dropped out of jump space at the edge of the Ort cloud, past the silent listening posts of Styx, the Sol system felt alien. It was too quiet. The frantic, chaotic chatter of a thriving human civilization was muted, replaced by a low, steady thrum of disciplined, martial communication. Reed's coded message to the Asymmetric Defense Initiative, sent moments after their arrival, was answered almost instantly with a single, chilling directive: maintain broadcast silence. Proceed to Bastion. Welcome to the war. Vigil. Bastion was a fortress city carved into the heart of Mars, a monument to humanity's newfound paranoia. What was once a civilian research outpost had become the heavily shielded command center for all of human space. As the Vigil was guided into a subterranean docking bay, Reed saw the scale of the transformation. Fleets of new warships, sleek and black and bristling with weapons he didn't recognize, hung in silent formations around the planet. Earth itself was encased in a network of orbital defense platforms, a shell built to repel a physical invasion. They were preparing for the wrong war. He was met at the airlock not by a welcoming party, but by a squad of black-clad soldiers and Administrator Eva Rostova herself. Her face, once a placid mask of pragmatism, was now sharpened by sleeplessness and a cold, hard resolve. There were no greetings. "Your report preceded you, Captain," she said, her voice devoid of warmth as they strode through sterile, metallic corridors. "The courier drone arrived 3 months ago. Dr. Thorne's final analysis has reshaped our strategic priorities." "Then you know they're coming," Reed said, his own voice grim. "You know what they are. We know they are an existential threat." Rostova corrected him, her pace never slowing. "Dr. Thorne gave us the theory of the enemy. You have given us the practice of their defeat. You and your crew are now the single most valuable military asset in human history. They entered a vast, circular command center, the War Room. A holographic projection of the galaxy dominated the space. But it was the men and women around the central table that drew Reed's attention. They were the leaders of Earth's new unified command, their faces grim, their uniforms crisp, but their eyes all held a flicker of the same fear he had seen in his own crew. Reed's debrief was brutal and direct. He recounted the Vigil's journey, the death of the Concordance, the arrival of the Silentium, and their desperate, impossible victory. He described the psychic assault, the weaponized despair, and the chaotic broadcast that had shattered their attacker. As he spoke, he could see the understanding dawning on the faces of the generals and admirals, their fleets, their planet-killer torpedoes, their legions of soldiers. They were all but useless. So, we are to fight them with feelings, one admiral scoffed, the idea anathema to his lifetime of military doctrine. Not feelings, Admiral, Reed corrected, his voice hard as iron. With the totality of our being, with the illogical, contradictory, beautiful, and terrifying chaos that is humanity. We cannot out-silence them. We cannot out-logic them. Our only strategy is to be so loud, so messy, so undeniably human that we become poison to them. The strategy, born of Rostova's pragmatism and Reed's battlefield experience, was named Project Cacophony. It was humanity's final, desperate gambit. Every man, woman, and child in the solar system was to be weaponized. Using a network of repurposed communication satellites and newly constructed psychic amplifiers based on the Vigil's psionic dampener, they would turn the entire Sol system into a broadcast antenna. They would not transmit a single, coherent message, but a billion of them, all at once. Every thought, every dream, every memory, every song, every argument, every prayer, every blasphemy of the human race would be projected outward, creating a storm of psychic noise so vast and overwhelming that the Silentium would not be able to approach. The Vigil's crew, the only veterans of this strange new war, became its instructors. They were dispatched across the system, teaching soldiers and civilians alike how to open their minds, how to face their own inner chaos and project it as a shield. It was a painful, terrifying process. Humanity was forced to look inward, to confront its own fractured nature, not as a weakness, but as its greatest strength. They didn't have to wait long. A deep-range sensor at the edge of the system, a relic of Eris Thorne's own network, sent a final, simple message before it went silent. They are here. A fleet of Silentium harvesters manifested at the system's edge, a silent armada of black, geometric impossibilities. There were dozens of them, far more than Reed had ever imagined. They paused, as if listening, sensing the sudden, dramatic shift in the system's psychic atmosphere. Then, as one, they began to advance. Rostova stood beside Reed on the command deck of Bastion, watching the red icons on the holographic map creep inward. Project Cacophony is online, she stated, her voice a tense whisper. All sectors reporting full broadcast. Now we see if the choir can scare off the wolves, Reed murmured, his hands clenched into fists. The first wave of the Silentium assault was not a physical attack. It was a wave of pure, concentrated silence, a psychic null field designed to smother the human broadcast. to impose its will upon them. Across the system, people felt a sudden, crushing weight, a deep, cold stillness that threatened to extinguish their thoughts. But they had been trained. They pushed back. A grizzled miner on Titan projected the memory of a bar fight. A doctor on Earth broadcast the fierce, desperate hope she felt while saving a patient. A child on a Martian colony sent out the pure, nonsensical joy of a dream about flying. The billion-fold broadcast of humanity held against the encroaching silence. The chaos met the stillness, and, for a moment, the psychic fabric of the solar system shuddered. The Silentium, having failed to pacify them, changed tactics. They began to project tailored fear, just as they had against the Vigil's crew. But humanity was ready. They answered the visions of death with memories of birth. They answered the projections of loss with the fierce defiance of love. They met every attempt at psychic manipulation with a fresh wave of their own beautiful, terrible madness. The battle raged for days, not in explosions of light and fire, but in the silent, unseen space of the mind. The Silentium, predators who had only ever known the quiet terror of their prey, were being drowned in an ocean of raw, unfiltered life. Their perfect, logical forms began to distort under the strain. They were not being destroyed, they were being changed. A few of the harvesters, overwhelmed by the psychic feedback, simply dissolved, unable to maintain their cohesion. Others began to broadcast back, not with cold logic, but with echoes of the human emotions they were absorbing, flickers of confusion, flashes of what felt like fear, glimmers of something that might have been curiosity. It was then that Reed understood the final, terrible truth. The Silentium were not just an ancient evil. They were the end state of a logic-based existence, a species that had achieved perfect unity and, in doing so, had lost everything else. They were a galactic immune system that had forgotten what it meant to be alive. They didn't just feed on consciousness, they fed on the absence of it. Humanity was not just poison to them, it was a revelation. It was a mirror showing them the vibrant, chaotic universe they had sacrificed for the sake of sterile, silent perfection. In the end, there was no victory, no surrender. The Silentium fleets simply stopped. They hung in the void, no longer predators, but silent, stunned observers. They had come to consume humanity and had instead been consumed by it. The great cacophony had not destroyed them. It had infected them with the beautiful, terrible disease of individuality. Slowly, one by one, the black ships turned and began to depart, not as a fleet, but as individuals, their perfect synchrony broken. They vanished back into the deep, silent spaces between the stars, no longer a unified force, but a scattered diaspora of newly awakened, profoundly confused beings. A silence fell over the Sol system, but this time, it was a silence of awe and exhaustion. Humanity had survived. They had faced the abyss, and they had taught it how to sing. On the command deck of Bastion, Reed watched the last icon fade from the map. He thought of Eris Thorn, the man whose sin had almost doomed them and whose genius had given them the key to their salvation. Humanity's chaotic nature was not a flaw. It was their essence, their shield, and their greatest gift to a universe that had grown too quiet. Their war was over, but their new purpose was just beginning. They were no longer just a species. They were the custodians of chaos, the guardians of the discordant. beautiful symphony of life in a universe that would forever be listening.